All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar, The Next Wave of Digital Competition Regulations Abroad and the Future of U.S. Competitiveness. My name is Jung-Han Chung. I'm the Policy Associate here at the Association of Competitive Technology, ACT, a global trade association representing small businesses and scale-ups around the world. We're very fortunate to have Scott Henderson, a native Nebraskan and a startup leader working with startups and scale-ups across the Midwest and around the U.S., as well as Jessica Melugin, a thought leader in the digital space with a wealth of experience working in the tech and telecom industry. Today, we're gathering policymakers and stakeholders to examine one of the most consequential shifts happening in technology policy today. For the past several years, the European Union's Digital Markets Act, otherwise known as the DMA, has been the dominant reference point in global conversations about reining in and regulating large digital platforms. The DMA introduced what's so-called an ex-ante approach, meaning regulators apply prescriptive rules before evidence of harm is established, based on a company's size and reach. The question on the table today is, as DMA-style competition regulations spread from Europe into the Indo-Pacific, Latin America, and beyond, what does that mean for American startups, American digital exports, and American competitiveness in the digital ecosystem? This is not a theoretical debate. The rules being written right now in Tokyo, Kuala Lumpur, and Seoul will reshape the operating conditions for US technology companies for the next decade. At a high level, the problem a lot of our ACT members have is that the value they generally derive from these marketplaces comes from their ability to remove bad actors and curate the so-called platform. The DMA's approach undermines the value of these marketplaces. Therefore, it goes against the foundational benefits that really democratize the app ecosystem and tech entrepreneurship. Now, as conversations unroll today, jurisdictions around the world are considering enacting similar versions of the DMA, and some of them think that it will help developers rather than in reality hurting a lot of the small business innovators. In today's conversations, we really want to unpack what the DMA means for SMEs and what the global landscape looks like for digital goods and services moving forward. Today, we're honored to open our today's discussion with a recorded remarks from a leader who has been on the forefront of U.S.-Asia digital trade policy. Representative Adrian Smith, who serves as chair of the U.S.-Japan Relations Caucus and the chairman of the House Trade Subcommittee, has been one of the most thoughtful leaders in Congress on the intersection of digital markets, trade, and American competitiveness in the Indo-Pacific. We'll now turn it to Representative Smith for his keynote remarks.
Good afternoon. I'm Congressman Adrian Smith. So sorry I cannot join you live today, but I'm grateful to the App Association for hosting this important discussion. Right now, we are at a true crossroads. The global digital economy is evolving rapidly, and with it, a wave of potentially disruptive interventions aimed at American companies. It's no secret that the online marketplaces and digital platforms have become central to how Americans and consumers around the world connect, shop, and certainly do business. Conversations like the one you are about to have are critical to ensuring we get this right. Today's discussion presents an important opportunity to examine the intersection of intellectual property and digital trade, two pillars of American economic strength and global leadership. These are not abstract policy debates. The outcomes of these conversations will shape the future of innovation, economic growth, and competitiveness for years to come. U.S. innovation remains one of our nation's greatest competitive advantages. It drives our economic engine and underpins our national security. IP-intensive industries account for roughly 41% of American GDP and support more than 63 million jobs, including so many in the technology sector alone. This success is a result of a system that rewards creativity, protects ideas, and fosters competition. That system has enabled the rise of a curated online marketplace where there are platforms that empower small businesses and encourage consumers to connect, especially in rural communities and markets. For states like Nebraska, where distance can be a barrier, these tools are essential. They allow entrepreneurs and producers to reach customers far beyond their local communities, creating new opportunities for growth and success. However, that success is increasingly under pressure. Around the world, we are seeing a growing trend of policies that disproportionately target U.S.-based digital companies. From digital services taxes to restrictive data policies and regulatory frameworks that, in practice, place heavier burdens on American firms. These interventions threaten to distort markets and undermine fair competition. Curated online marketplaces are especially exposed because of their scale and role in connecting buyers and sellers. They are often singled out in ways that can advantage domestic competitors or impose disproportionate compliance costs. Over time, the cumulative effect of these measures risks fragmenting the global digital economy and weakening the competitiveness of U.S. companies. And when these platforms are constrained, the impact is felt far beyond the companies themselves. Small businesses, independent sellers, and rural entrepreneurs, many of whom rely on these marketplaces to access customers and grow their operations, are often the first to feel the consequences. We are seeing similar challenges in the realm of intellectual property. Weak protections and inconsistent enforcement in foreign markets continue to undermine American innovators. I'm also encouraged by the Trump administration's efforts to secure commitments from trading partners on intellectual property and digital trade through the negotiations on agreements for reciprocal trade. However, commitments must be matched by meaningful enforcement. When partners fall short, the United States must be prepared to respond and ensure American companies are treated fairly. As you begin your discussions today, I encourage you to consider the broader implications of these trends. The policies being debated and implemented today will shape the future of global commerce, innovation, and economic opportunity. It is essential that we remain focused on promoting fair competition, protecting intellectual property, and ensuring that American companies and the workers and communities they support are not placed at a disadvantage. These are important conversations, and your engagement on these issues matters. The insights and ideas shared in this forum can certainly help better inform policy, strengthen international cooperation, and reinforce the principles that have long supported American innovation and leadership. Thank you again for the opportunity to share my perspective. I hope you have a productive and meaningful meeting.
And again, we'd like to thank Adrian Smith for his, thank you again, Representative Adrian Smith for his opening remarks and the framing we just heard, that regulatory spillover from DMA-inspired frameworks is a live competitiveness threat, not a distant one, and is exactly the lens through which I want us to start this panel conversation today, because what Representative Smith described from more of a governing level, our two panelists today can make a little bit more concrete and real. They can tell us a little bit more about what these frameworks actually do to the companies building in these ecosystems, but also more importantly, what US policymakers can actually do about it. So let's dive in. And before kind of diving into the questions, I kind of want to give a little bit more of a backdrop to kind of the so-called DMA model expanding and spreading. First, I think we talk about Japan, and Japan has enacted a new platform competition law last year, the Mobile Software Competition Act, otherwise known as MSCA, while South Korea is in active legislative debates. Brazil has also placed its new crafted competition law on a legislative fast track last week. Latin American and APEC economies are watching closely, and the features being debated within these legislations, mandated interoperability, service unbundling restrictions, and restrictions on platform integrations are not abstract terms, as Representative Smith mentioned. They directly affect how digital products are built and how they reach customers and how much it costs to compete across borders. We'll backtrack a little bit and we'll revisit these themes later, but I first want to go to Scott. N-Motion, powered by generators, began around 12, 13 years ago, and with over 100 startups having graduated from the accelerator, and over the 5-year, 6-year span you've been there, You've been able to invest over $5 million into over 50 startups in Nebraska and the Midwest. Can you first, tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing at Generators and N Motions and, a lot about the startups and the great community you work with?
Absolutely. I appreciate being here. It's always nice to be keynoted with a representative from your own state. So two people from Nebraska that people can now know that they at least saw on a webinar, which is awesome. Yeah, my work here in Motion and our work broader in Generator, started within the last 15 years, and there was that moment where startup accelerators started, where we had people investing money early into early stage ideas. We had the commercialization of the internet was making sure that making it possible to create companies from anywhere. But what we were seeing at that time was people going to the major cities where the capital markets were, New York, Boston, and the Valley. But our work has been intentionally trying to find more people to be willing to invest in the best and brightest in our communities, so they can build it here. And we could see the economic waterfall that comes from high growth companies, especially those who are able to have a great exit, whether through IPO or from acquisition. And so, it's been interesting to see within the lens of Nebraska, but also the lens of Generator, which started in Wisconsin. Now we operate in 50 communities, mostly in outside the major three markets. We're in the Central Valley of California. We're in Vegas. We're all the way up in North Dakota. Brushed down to all the way down to Alabama. And the closest we get to New York and Boston is Rutland, Vermont. So we're in capital constrained markets in the U.S. and have expanded into other countries, including Japan that you mentioned, in terms of our niche being outside the major markets and finding those folks in capital constraint. And so the work that we're doing is, I think you want to go on to an expert level. This is not novice level. This is the expert of expert levels to try to build a high growth startups in these types of capital constrained markets. So there are a lot of other alligators and things that are here trying to kill our startups, let alone regulatory frameworks. But it is real. I think the work that I've been able to do, having been a Nebraskan, as a sixth generation Nebraskan, I moved away for 20 years. I spent time in Atlanta, Indiana, and Boston before coming back. What's fascinating to me is to see how an idea that that was something that was an idea 3 years ago, three and a half years ago, now has grown into Nave Analytics is this company I'm talking about. They do ground moisture detection, and they're actually now in, I think, 6 or 7 countries with this ag tech innovation. But 4 years ago, we were just trying to figure out how to get this thing off the ground and try to get the first paid customer. So you want to talk about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Regulatory frameworks is not on the bottom level of that. It will impact us, but you're just trying to get a product or a product enough of the concept and enough of a customer. So proof of customer, proof of concept. I always talk about how this is like 2 yoked horses that you're trying to plow a field with. And that's, you're just trying to breathe oxygen. You're just trying to stay alive. But quickly, all of a sudden, regulatory frameworks come and you bump up it as your product gets distributed across into different markets. You start to realize that there's a lot of different games that you have to, rules of the games you have to understand to be able to play it.
Yeah, that's exactly the interesting idea, right? A lot of our members at at ACT have always run into this, when you're building something. I think a lot of startups are, working with 2 to 3 people firms, and the last thing you're worrying about is, what is the legal compliance to this XYZ thing that's going to be happening, right? You want to just be able to deploy your product, create the product, deploy the product, and have users or people that you want to use it. I guess that maybe leads to the first question is, for someone who's building a startup today in the digital ecosystem, I think Representative Smith mentioned this really important thing, especially maybe from you as well in Nebraska, might be specifically critical, is what role do platforms play for SMEs who are looking to specifically grow and scale their business? And as you mentioned, the frameworks really changed the application dichotomy of all that. But, for you, from your perspective, how do these platforms kind of play a role in that whole game?
Well, kind of like trying to think about what was life like driving across from Chicago to Denver before we had highways, like actual national highways, before the interstate. What was it like to go across? This is infrastructure that was, I mean, I remember my grandfather talking about as a kid driving in the back seat of their car to Chicago, all on dirt roads. I could, can you imagine the speed and the friction that was there? And that's, I think, probably the thing I think about when I think about with or without these platforms. I mean, how can you envision creating a company and shipping it out? And very real life, one of my most recent companies that we've invested in. So what we do is we find companies that are early stage. We invest $100,000 at this early stage, and then help them get more customers and get more connections, and help them raise that next round of capital. So the most recent cohort we had that graduated here in February is ViaSite, as it's called, ViaSite.ai. They're only a year-old company based out of Kansas City and Minneapolis. And their very first customer is Brissa, based out of Portugal. And what they're doing is they're taking a mobile phone, using a mobile phone app on the Google Play Store right now, and then the iOS is coming next, so that these companies can have one of their workers download the app, put it on a dashboard, and drive through road construction zones just to be able to identify what needs to be changed. Like, okay, so right out of the gate, their very first customer is in Portugal, which means you got a GDPR regulations that they have to go back and early. Unfortunately, it was like the very first thing they had to do. So they were able to blur out stuff and make that happen. Now, that's just an example of some regulatory framework. But this is because they're able to ship through the Google Play Store. Their software that was built in the United States is now being used in Portugal on a daily basis. That's real. I mean, think of how long it would have taken back in the day of mail order catalogs, or having to do direct mail with the stuffing envelopes, and then trying to figure out that stuff. So it's a real thing that happens very quickly, and these marketplaces make it possible for you to ship your app quickly, and then start to get customers paying you, which is vital.
Mm-hmm. And I remember the days you mentioned that so vividly. It's like I remember buying the Microsoft Office suite at like Best Buy and having to buy the card and scratch at the key code. Maybe some of the viewers here won't be as old as me, but I lived in the days where we had to do that, and software's on a shelf. So you almost kind of explain these curated online marketplaces like app stores or larger digital platforms as almost not just a distribution channel for small businesses, but like you mentioned earlier, they're operating infrastructures that are critical for SMEs. I think a lot of times payment, security, discovery, protection, all the things you just mentioned almost gives SMEs a rail for SMEs to just ride on and deploy the technologies. I think that's a really interesting thing. And I think, Jess, I want to kind of go over to you. Scott kind of gave us a boots on the ground view of what's going on, and you've been watching the regulatory picture from the policy side. What do policymakers often miss regarding the relationship between curated online marketplaces and these digital platforms and its developers or users?
Yeah, I think Scott makes a really important point about the scope of these platforms and how it expands your possible consumer base, right, all around the world, and to Portugal in the example he used. And of course, along with that comes services and conveniences. But I think one thing that policymakers might not think about too much, because they're thinking about lots of things, is that these platforms also act as trust proxies for potential consumers, right? You might not know some company out of the Midwest of the US for Adam, but you know that if they're available in a trusted app store, then that makes you a little more confident. You know that this has already been vetted, this has been checked out, there's going to be integrated services, and there's going to be recourse that's not going to be chasing someone down halfway around the world. It's going to be someone you've already decided you trust and is in your pocket, maybe literally, right? So I think that one of the problems with this policy approach that's spreading around the world, sort of, even if it's not exactly based on the DMA in other countries, it's certainly inspired by that. And I'm sure we'll talk about the details. But one of the things that I think policymakers in the US should be aware of, and its impact on small and medium-sized entities is that it breaks that trust proxy, right? When you start treating platforms like they're public utilities and you have to let everyone on, it has a lot of negative effects. But one of them I think people don't think about because I can show you numbers about how it disincentivizes investment in those platforms and innovation. But I would have to pull some customer off the street to say to you, do you have bigger trust issues with some small startup you've never heard of than you might if you knew that they had been vetted by an app store or an online marketplace that you were already dealing with, right? I think there's some confidence, and we'll use kind of a more nuts and bolts marketplace as an example, that you have more confidence buying things off Amazon, I think, than you might if you just ran across a freestanding website. Perhaps there's a lot of consumers who know that they'll have recourse. They can go to Amazon if something's wrong. They have someone to be in communication with. And I think the DMA, one of the sort of soft problems with it is it breaks that trust proxy. And I think, of course, that's a disadvantage for consumers who aren't as willing to try what might be like the next great thing. And also, it's certainly a disadvantage for those small and medium startups that, for a fee, they're willing to say, I would like to borrow some of your trust. You can look under the hood of my product here and we will make sure we're going by the rules you've set for your marketplace. I'm going to give you something for sure in return for that. But you grow the scope and you get that trust that I think really sets this revolution in products and retail apart from maybe some of the past revolutions, at least here in the US, where, the fight was sort of about the big box stores versus Main Street. It's not like that here, right? Because now these big platforms are serving as scope and trust proxies for the smallest little startup if it can meet the standards of that marketplace or that app store. And I think that builds in benefits at every level. Consumers, there's so many more choices you have, right? Now that we have these things like you can find the weirdest, craziest things on all these platforms that, you wouldn't be able to find maybe in your hometown. Also for innovation and for startups, like this is such an amazing opportunity to get to piggyback on top of these big companies and reach so many more consumers and just have that opportunity for growth and scale so much quicker. It's like Scott said, at some point it's important to have customers and get paid. That's a thing we're for. So I think that's kind of one of the soft problems with DMA is that by cracking it open, you might be doing a favor to some of those countries' domestic competitors, but you're not doing a favor to small and medium startups who use those big platforms. And you're not doing a favor to consumers here in the US and abroad who now are a little less trusting. I never think twice about what I download on my mobile phone because I know people a lot more knowledgeable and informed than I have already done that vetting. So we break that trust proxy, and I think that proxy has been such an amazing innovation from this space. I'm not sure if other countries are thinking about that, but I know based on what we're seeing largely in Europe right now, but probably more and more around the world, U.S. lawmakers should be thinking about that because those customers and those small and medium businesses are also their constituents. It's really important to understand how this all actually works.
That's a great point. And I think I want to maybe throw it back to Scott as well on a quick question. I think the DMA rhetoric, right? It's harping on this idea of, signaling these quote unquote gatekeepers as, stifling the innovation process and competition in the digital market space. But I think we've heard here today, so far that I think that narrative is a little false sometimes. And as Scott and as Jess mentioned, the larger platforms provide a little bit of an outlook for a lot of these SMEs to scale and grow. How would you, maybe Scott, could you maybe characterize your opinion around the idea that small businesses are being crushed by large platforms? Is that a truth, or is that, a unrelated fact to basically this whole conversation?
Good question. I just want to echo what Jessica was saying. I think these platforms, especially if you've never had to ship an app through the App Store or through Google Play and see what the process takes. There is a lot that goes into getting something pushed and approved for upload to that, right? And so, there is a lot of vetting already happening, and sometimes frustratingly so, is if you're trying to ship your product quick to market and get in front of people. But you got to understand it's their marketplace. But to your question, I think the reality, and this is true for any technology, is once somebody establishes, a market dominance, being a major player, one or two or three, there's the power law effect kicks in, and there is a human tendency to try to then those those who become incumbent players to start to lock down that market so that they don't feel the threat of being disrupted themselves. I mean, these are disruptors who have established a new market. And so I think there is a definite feeling from a small and medium-sized business perspective, a founder perspective, of trying to figure out, are we frenemies? Are we friends if you're going on these platforms? Because we've seen, in the if you own these platforms, you get a lot of data, and there can be some human tendency to take advantage of that. I think there's definitely, if you're in the small and medium sized fish world, you're always thinking about bigger fish and what can they do to you. But I think there's, you have to live in a paradox that's why would they do that? So my opinion is it just depends on which platform we're talking about and what's the opportunity. Because if you do own the platform and the marketplace, then you're going to have you have to maintain that trust, right? So if you go back into the marketplaces, being here in the Midwest, being in the Great Plains, if you go into the cattle market, you go in, and where folks bring their cattle into the stockyards and to sell, that is all built on trust. And those marketplaces that historically that violated those trusts, that then saw the ramification of folks not wanting to come to that marketplace to do business. And I think, I think there's always the potential for that to happen. And I think that's at the same time, that's sometimes something that gets overlooked by those who are looking at regulation or even at policy, not just on the federal level, but on the state level. I've been sitting through a lot of state legislative committees recently because our legislature is in session. And we have a different act called the Business Innovation Act, which has been funding prototype grants and seed investment stuff. And we've been out advocating. But when in Nebraska being unique, where we have we're unicameral, so we don't have two houses, we have one house. But they say that the people are the second house. So each bill that goes up has to be reviewed in front of a committee, and it gives public comment. So I got to hear a lot of commentary on other bills that had nothing to do with what I was sitting through. But a lot of them that we're going through was algorithmic pricing, dynamic pricing models. And that's an interesting conversation that's popped up on the state level, where state legislatures are, seeing bills proposed around, restricting dynamic pricing. And I think what it gets down to is, on a human level, the individuals who are involved don't understand how it works and get afraid. And I think when you have fear come into the policy market, the tendency is then to overprotect without understanding their downstream ramifications, the secondary and tertiary ramifications of this. And so, I think that the fact is that these platforms and these marketplaces can be leveraged in ways that hurt the small and medium-sized businesses. But that's where we have to all come into it with an understanding of what's the federal as well as the state level regulations that are being enacted, that all of this is friction points, right? So is it going to help us or hurt us? And think of not just the first level, but the second and third level impacts.
Yeah, I agree. I think you mentioned this specific idea of, friction, and those DMA cascading effects, like you mentioned, have friction. And I think a lot of times, where I'm sure a lot of the startups you work with, something that we always say at ACT is, a barrier to exit is a barrier to entry. And a lot of the, I guess what I would say, the themes that come out of the DMA and DMA style regulations is really looking at, these larger companies are just definitively de facto hurting smaller businesses. And I think it's sometimes on the contrary, like you mentioned, I've was doing some reading of my own, and I've heard 8 of your companies have exited and generated over $60 million in returns to founders. And one of them being our own very own ACT member, Quantified Ag, being acquired by Merck. I think you mentioned this really important, that friction point where policy matters for SME direction, and it doesn't just apply to the incumbents who are playing in the game. Those policies scatter and have a cascading effect downstream. And I think you put it really perfectly, that sometimes those rules and those rules that you play by, you kind of have to understand and use to the best of your advantages and your leverage. So, one off of that as well is, I feel like, Jess, we worked on this paper a few years ago, titled, it was related to David, on his way to David to crush Goliath. I remember that piece that we worked on. I was kind of curious. I wanted an anecdote from you. Where do you think SME in this big fight in terms of digital competition? Where do SMEs see themselves, and where should they be in this entire war, or almost, yeah, war? I would say I gotta describe it as a war.
Yeah, so I think the political version of things, right, is like um, these big companies are a menace, and finally governments are sticking up uh, for the little guy. I think we've talked about how that's not the case. It's a bit more nuanced than that. And Scott's point about, some of the stuff that's going to be the policy of the platforms, not every small or medium-sized entity is going to like. But I think a problem with the DMA approach is when you regulate top down and so heavily, you kind of break some of the differentiating characteristics of those different platforms, right? So if I'm launching something new and I don't like one platform's terms, but perhaps I find the next one's more agreeable, well, if you crack everything open and make it all run like they're water pipes owned by the city, you don't have that flexibility to say, I'm fine with these terms. I want to do business with that. And I think that goes to the heart of a lot of the DMA or DMA-like proposals we see in Brazil, Japan, South Korea, India. At the heart of them, just to be a bit of an ideologue for a moment, there's a real skepticism for private action allocating resources and private property rights. And, the idea that before there even is a problem, ex ante, we're going to have regulators say what you can and can't do with your business, with your private property, what those contracts should look like and what they shouldn't, I think is, just so fundamentally not the American approach to protecting competition, which is we kind of have at least a certain amount of faith in private industry. We're going to let this sort out. We can't know in advance what's going to work and what isn't. And if there's a problem, if a problem arises, come back to us. There's legal recourse for us to deal with that. That's always been sort of the American pro-innovation approach with technology, right? It's not a mother may I precautionary principle sort of approach that we see in Europe and we see in a lot of other areas considering DMA-like regulation. And I think that just leaves room for so much more growth, innovation, new products. There's many reasons why the US is a global tech leader. We've always been a place that ambitious, smart, hardworking people want to come to build that business. We certainly have that built into our advantage. But also our regulatory framework is just so distinctly different from many other places in the world. And the adoption of more jurisdictions with DMA style regulation, I hope it throws that into relief for American politicians, legislators, and business people to say there's something special here about us saying try it first. If there's a problem, it's not the Wild West. The laws are still on the books, but that's very different than a DMA style approach that assumes, oh, you're a certain size, you're probably up to no good, and you're probably hurting competition. That's a very different approach than the U.S. has taken, at least over the last 40 years, since a lot of the tech has been around, that says consumers are at the heart of this. And if consumers aren't being hurt, you really don't have a case here. We're not here sticking up for competitors. We're here sticking up for the consumer. And whether that's big tech, medium tech, or little tech that gets it done, were for that. And whatever new and innovative business arrangement or type of service or delivery they come up with, I think that we start from a place of yes until there's a problem. The approach of the DMA is much different. It says, I've already identified who I think is going to be a problem based on size, which is not a great metric for consumer harm or consumer welfare. And I think that, the EU was a leader on this. They did a lot of the groundwork on that. And I think that's kind of provided like a ready-made blueprint for a lot of jurisdictions that, for whatever reason are concerned. I don't have any insight into what that exactly might be. Like, I think in Europe, we have a lot of regulators on the record being pretty open about the fact that they're targeting U.S. companies over their domestic industry. I don't know. I don't think that's the case everywhere around the world, because some of the domestic industry of those countries does get caught up in these regulations too. But I think in Europe, there's just a deep skepticism of letting the market work that I hope we don't have in the US to the same extent, because we've had such a boom and benefit to so much growth here in the tech space. But I think that for other countries, it's tempting when so much of the groundwork has been done to just tweak it a little bit in their own and see if you can get in on a little of, like Scott was saying, the fear, which I think is more feelings than anything you could probably prove economically. But I think in the US, we've made a wise choice by saying you have to be able to show economic harm to the consumer. And we've just seen with we were talking about the acquisitions and the positive exits, that's so good for the whole eco-cycle of the economy, including consumers, right? Like new products, new innovations, whether they're purchased and scaled up by bigger companies or they're rolled out as the little guy. The point is all that benefit flows to consumers. And if you break those cycles, you end up with really being probably decades behind in terms of a lot of tech matrix like we see in the EU that kind of missed the upgrowth of the last technological revolution. And I think with the DMA and the AI Act and a lot of other things, it's really risking missing out on this current one or this almost next one.
Yeah, that I always talk about it as, a DMA contagion, and catching the DMA cough almost, right? Because you do see this quote unquote fear, right? Because I think a lot of the jurisdictions want to be the leading regulator or leading face to digital competition and digital regulation. I think, like you said, you see this appetite to be the first, to be the first, to be the one. And I think from what we've learned today, we caution a lot of jurisdictions to maybe sit back and examine, as we've seen the DMA implementation at its 2-year mark. We've seen different reports come out, the Draghi report, and many other different reports come out, kind of showing some of the effects that have been happening with the DMA implementation. And I think those are eye-opening sources for a lot of people to look into to understand a little bit more about, hey, what have been the effects actually been? What has been the reality for SMEs? And the realities, and honest, are bleak for a lot of those EU companies. So I want to maybe zoom out a little bit for a moment from the regulatory mechanics and maybe get a little bit more into the consequences. As Jessica's been explaining, what's been spreading. I think Scott's described a really good job about what's at stake operationally for a lot of these SMEs. So if we were to maybe play devil's advocate and maybe play in a different scenario, if the DMA contagion framework is now if it became a global default, Scott, I want to first go to you. We've heard about some of these regulatory spillovers for U.S. businesses from the Digital Markets Act being implemented in the EU. ACT, we actually did a survey late last year, which found that on average, these delays cost small businesses in the EU and UK an average of $109,000 to $375,000 per year. In your experience, can you explain how how a product delay may impact a business, or maybe how some of your businesses or yourself have maybe felt some of the operational effects of these DMA-like frameworks? Or is this really just a theoretical harm? I don't think it's a theoretical harm, but maybe you may have a different opinion.
I think, I mean, I would go just down to the lived experience of creating these companies from scratch. Startup founders, company, small, the ones that are aspirational growth, right? If you think about the two types of entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurs that more are looking for linear growth and, nice building a company that will feed their employees and, maybe 10, 20, 30, 50 people, 100 people. That's great. Those are all good. Those are good, healthy companies to have. The high growth, high aspirational founders are the ones that are two or three people trying to build something that can grow into a 200 person, 500 person, 100, 1,000 person company that's hitting 100 million annual revenue, recurring revenue a year. So it becomes highly valuable, right? So that they're both, regardless of the aspiration, they're both faced with the same thing: is they still have to get up every day and find the problem that the customer that they're focused on wants to solve, and have that customer choose them. And so, when you're going to something that's more transformational, which is the higher growth pathway, that you're usually an emerging technology or a new market opportunity or a new regulatory framework that's rolling out that you want to take advantage of and claim the territory fast, you're fighting. Your biggest competitor is status quo. Your biggest competitor is apathy. I mean, status quo exists because it works. Those with vested interest get the benefit, right? And so these aspirational startup founders of the high growth side, they're waking up every day committing to getting kicked in the face by the world. I mean, that's a pathway that's hard enough. And that's just changing people's behaviors, right? I got asked this by a PhD once in a tech transfer. Like, why is it so hard for people these startups to in their journeys? I think because, especially if you're looking at organizations as your companies or something like that, groups of people as your customers, you've got to convince the groups of people who already have habit patterns to change their habit patterns. And so, I think let's just use that as ground truth here. That's the world that they're already operating in. They're already trying to change the way people operate and take advantage of it. And so, from is this a real thing or is it theoretical? It's real, because if you're saying the rules of the game are going to be this, and these are the DMA type of things, is that where we're going to go after, or permutation, or whatever the novel thing, the jurisdiction that we're talking about is going to bring into it. Well, then that increases the complexity and the challenge for that person to change behaviors. And I think I would say, I mean, this is not the answer that you would probably want from me at this point, but I would say, it's just yet another challenge. Okay, we'll have to design our startup for it. But if it's not known, if this is going to come after the fact, and and all of a sudden we run into the reality of trying to put our idea in the market that we're trying to change things out, and then all of a sudden it's changing, the rules of the game are changing, the goalposts are changing. Well, what happens is, to your question, is how this impacts these high growth startups is, you're living on fumes. I mean, in the early days, you're either putting cash into the bucket yourself, you're trying to get some early friends and family investors, you're trying to get an angel investor who are betting on you, and knowing the chances of you succeeding are very small, but just want to support you. And so that's oxygen. That money is oxygen. And if you're trying to build something and you don't have a huge savings account to not pay yourself, and you have to pay yourself, time is money. Time is money. And specifically, the cost of delays and having another 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 10 months, that kills companies. That kills those who had that. It's like a sprout that's kind of coming up, and then you hit a hot spell and a dry spell, and it's just going to kill that thing off. And so it's real. I've seen it happen where the companies that were building something ran into the reality of what as they got into a marketplace that they had to deal with. I've talking about these app stores that have their own vetting process. I invested in a company 2 years ago that just got its app shipped. It took almost 2 years and 3 different development teams. Now, there were some own goals on their part, and it fortunately for them, they have an angel investor who helped bridge that gap. Without that angel investor, that company would have died a year and a half ago. And so I think there is realities that the time and delay when you're dealing with this high growth time is money, it really is time is money, because when you take on investment, then the clock is ticking that you have to be able to hit revenue targets that are on an up and up curve. Our mindset as venture-backed companies is 20% month-over-month growth, which, if you only have $100 in revenue, that's not a lot of money next month, but that compounds. You can go from $1,000 in monthly revenue to $1 million in monthly revenue by just staying on track of 20% month over month. And so any kind of regulatory friction or changing goalposts for these early stage aspirational founders they're thinking today is, what their vision of today is actually what most people's vision of 5 years from now will be. So they're trying to move the world to that way. And if they're getting this friction, they're not going to be able to push that idea forward because they die on the vine.
Exactly. And I think we always say innovation always moves way faster than the pace of government, right? And I think, like you mentioned, these scale-ups and startups who are just starting, as we mentioned earlier, 1 or 3 person teams, they don't have a legal compliance team separately from a lot of these larger incumbents. These rules don't just change, the DMA's rules and compliance regimes don't just change the mechanisms and mechanics of how large platforms operate, but underlyingly throughout these with the conversations we've been having today, Scott put it perfectly, these goalposts are changing. And if they change ever more through jurisdiction to jurisdiction, a lot of these digital companies, the moment you launch an app, in theory, you are now a global company. You're able to be downloaded theoretically anywhere. Those jurisdictions having different compliance laws, and imagining yourself having to create code for, this app store here, this app store here, this app store here, this app here, maybe 10 to 12 different app stores. It's just cost. And like you mentioned before, I think this, when you're working on fumes, as he said, I think all these quotes you're saying are perfect. You really don't have any margin for error. And I think SMEs need the largest, margin for error to be able to keep growing. And I think while the DMAs aim to, support these SMEs, we're seeing these, other effects. And I think, that's really going to affect how SMEs are looking to basically grow and scale their businesses, not just here in the US or domestically in a specific region, but to be a global business. And that's really going to impact how our US developers are really, facing these issues head on. Jess, I kind of want to move to you next. We've seen the spread of DMA-like legislation abroad. I want to specifically mention, Korea. There's the Online Platform Fairness Act, which adopts, a platform-only scopes like the DMA, rather than a activity-based one. I think the KFTC has said openly that, they're not approaching this from an ex-ante standpoint, but in practice, there are some similar mechanisms or compliance requirements similar to the DMA fines. So similarly, there's a 10% global sales revenue fine within the Fairness Act as well. Article 13 functions less as a platform to business fairness rule, but more as a general purpose rule that gives the KFTC really broad discretion and over enforcement, while leaving, the key boundaries of specific allocation and discretion to a presidential decree. So, this leaves a lot of questions to be answered. And for a lot of US firms who may be operating in Korea or potentially other regions that are adopting similar legislation like this, you know, what are the real costs if DMA style regulation becomes, like Scott said, the status quo? And with Korea being in a very unique perspective, having recent issues with U.S. Based firm Coupang, I think there's a real I think we'll move into this in the next topic as well. But I think there's a real trade argument to be made here as well, and a trade dilemma for a lot of these businesses and the SMEs who might fall under the larger discussion of the trade talks. But I think the SME voices still need to be heard here. So I really want to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think Korea has made commitments previously to be a good trading partner with the U.S. And I think that the incident you pointed to, which is, kind of a U.S. firm, certainly puts some doubt about those good intentions. I think that Korea is interesting because it has a a very successful, thriving domestic tech sector too. But I think that when you see a targeting like that of the U.S., it allows people to wonder: is this sort of a bad faith protectionist effort in some sense? And that certainly would be a shame. I mean, a lot of free trade organizations for a long time have sort of said, okay, across the board for everyone, being discriminatory is not cool, if you will. No, that's not a term they would use. That's not legal jargon, but it's frowned upon. And I think that that's one thing we kind of have to keep an eye out for, and something that trade representatives and legislators should be aware of and be thinking about with all of this. I mean, so much of this story is making all those people who have the chance to influence this in a positive direction for small, medium businesses, for consumers, for U.S. global tech leadership, making them aware of these issues and how important they are, and explaining that, this idea that you're going to beat up on the big guys and that it's just going to be all for the better, it really leaves out the benefits they provide to the smaller and medium-sized players in this field. So it's not just as easy as saying, okay, well, we're chopping off the tallest heads and everything's going to be better. It's not the case. You're breaking something all the way down the cycle for small, medium, and consumers. So I think the more that trade officials and legislators are aware of how this ecosystem actually works, what are the real problems and what are the imagined problems, I think the better for ensuring that the machinery for innovation, progress, wealth creation, growth all remains well-oiled and functioning. So I think if you see a proliferation of this to some extent, you start to wonder, where's the tipping point for just global innovation, right? As it gets more difficult for U.S. startups to operate around the globe because it's fractured, the regulatory environment, that certainly hurts us, but it hurts the consumers also in those countries. And I think, there's just a lot to be said for the American approach, which is, a much more pro-innovation, pro-private property, and pro-experimenting. And even when those experiments by big, small, whatever companies don't work, that's okay, right? Live and learn, we adjust. It's much easier to pivot back from that as a private entity than it is to put fundamentally harmful regulations in place and then try to peel them back. We just don't see that. And I think the delay point that was made earlier is so important. And we can see from certain European regulation that a lot of the big U.S. tech firms delayed some of their AI product rollout there. So if those big companies with very well-staffed legal and compliance departments can't figure out what the regulations are, what the rules are, and how to do this in a way that compliance is assured, I don't know how in the world we expect smaller firms who are struggling to get to the next stage and the next funding and the next marker for success are supposed to navigate all that. I think it's just seems to be sort of the idea of some people who have never run a business or never been adjacent to someone who knows, if you're running a small thing or you're trying to get something off the ground, you're the guy that stays late, you're working weekends, you're doing whatever it takes, you don't pay you're paying yourself last. So the idea that even if the biggest firms can't comply and there's uncertainty with the rules, that they're willing to say, we're not rolling this out into a huge market that could be very profitable because we don't even understand. That's so much to introduce that kind of uncertainty around the globe into all these markets. I think you can quibble with this or that policy, but let's just be reasonable and agree that's overall downward pressure on wealth creation, innovation, progress, benefits to consumers. It's hard enough, as Scott was saying, I'm sure it is hard enough to have a good idea, to actually make something that takes that idea and makes it usable for others, to scale, all those things. So why are we adding another layer of difficulty when we don't even know for sure there's a problem? When, once again, there is an approach that the U.S. has taken where we say, if there's a problem, we can address that problem. But until that, you guys have at it. Let's see what you can think of next. Let's see what you can get in the hands of consumers. So I just caution other jurisdictions to Europe has been nice enough to run this experiment for you. And I don't think it has gone as well as they hoped it would. I think they're extracting a lot of money from big US firms, but I don't think that the consumers of Europe are enjoying a lot of broken services and a lot less convenience in their products. So I think those things have to be balanced out and weighed against sort of this regulatory enthusiasm that we see kind of popping up all over the world.
Yeah, I really couldn't have said it better. Those overly broad conduct rules, in these developing markets, will certainly, SMEs will face, tighten and cost prohibitive margins and basically delayed research and development cycles, slower growth, and all the things you mentioned. It's basically a death spell for many SMEs. And ACT, we did a study uh, earlier or late last year with the Southeast Asian Policy Institute, and we found that, SMEs pay an astonishing 70% of the um, $3.07 billion annual compliance burden. So about $2.15 billion will fall directly into SMEs. And like Scott and Jess both mentioned, with SMEs leading this innovation cycle here, both domestically in the US, but also US developers in other countries with other clients in other jurisdictions, these rules now are really going to affect how these firms domestically or do well domestically and also do well in those markets, competing with those other domestic jurisdiction companies that are out in those foreign lands. A lot of those companies or the domestic companies here in the US are really going to have to compete and really go through a different or another hoop of regulations to really understand and be compliant. So it's a real big loop for them, especially when they have 1 to 2 people to deal with that. Well, I wanted to wrap it up and thank you guys again today for your tremendous expertise. I think I've learned a lot. I always learn a lot learning from talking to Jess, but Scott, I always learned a lot learning from what the SMEs go through. But I wanted to maybe close it up and Scott first, maybe, um, how can startups leverage policy insight and knowledge in their journey from being just starting off, maybe in Series A funding to then being potentially acquired or even, doing a initial public offering? What, how can startups leverage their knowledge in the policy game to basically better prepare themselves and better be a success in the marketplace?
I've been thinking about that a lot lately since I've been very involved on the state level of policy. And I think the real answer is it's up to each of us. So like there is no real startup lobby. I don't know if you guys know this. I mean, there's not that goes into state legislatures that because we don't have the money to put towards it like the big guys do, the big tech guys do. And I think that the big lesson for founders and these folks that early employees at the small and medium-sized enterprises that we're talking about is that if we're not telling our story to policymakers, we're not sharing our stories with those that our representatives, our senators, our on state level and the U.S. level, then these folks don't have the understanding of what we go through. And so a lot of what we've been doing has been getting these stories and out and into policy makers' hands, putting the facts together. It's up to us. It's up to us to tell these stories. I mean, you were mentioning some of the stats earlier. I mean, like Generator writ large over the last 14 years, and we've got 2,100 startups that have come through our programs. We've impacted so many people, and to ourselves, we've been around this long. We're now realizing the importance is strategically important to tell our stories. So we're putting a lot more time and energy towards putting white papers together, putting videos together, putting social media campaigns, doing press releases around this. We have to tell our story. So that's probably the number one thing. And I think, anything we're talking about regulation, anything that's going to slow us down. And those of you who are in these offices that are helping shape legislation, we cannot talk about this idea of regulation being friction without talking about the holding down the federal fundings for SBIR and STDRs, the grant programs that help give the lifeblood and the oxygen to these startups to build through their ideas without having to burn through a lot of their own personal thing. But I think we have to be able to say, first off, to answer your question is tell our story. It's up to us. If we don't tell these stories, we get out there and help people understand what it's like to live this startup founder life, then why would we expect them to write the laws for them? And I think for those of you who are writing laws, I'd say be very cognizant of the fact that friction slows things down. But on the front end of this, how can we make sure that we have good policy in place to make sure that we're strategically investing in the next big ideas so that we have new technologies that can pop up and emerge that then we have to worry about do we have to put a policy in place to if the harms or not harms? We need to continue to invest on the top of the funnel, not just focus on the friction on the end of the funnel.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better. And lastly, to Jess, American policymakers here in the audience today are wondering what lessons they should learn here. On the one hand, trade negotiators at USTR have been clear that they oppose some forms of digital competition regulations. Recent 301 investigations have been triggered within the manufacturing and import and export space, and that's good news. But the mixed news is that Congress has been flirting with its own version of the DMA, called a bill called American Innovation and Choice Online Act, or other known as ACOA. What is one overarching lesson for American policymakers here, and what course of action would you recommend to close this out?
I think that, again, Europe has been kind enough to run the experiment for us on that type of legislation. And I think that many valuable lessons can be learned about the perils of that approach and should be a big flashing red light to instituting the same approach here domestically in the US. Not only does it undermine our ability to push back on international efforts to do that, but also I don't know why, we can guess why maybe some foreign regulators would like to shoot American tech in the foot, but why we want to shoot our own goose laying the golden egg, I think is beyond me. And the idea that it's big versus small tech or anything like that, I think is a misunderstanding of the situation. So I think look to Europe to see how it's going for them, and make your decision accordingly when those same ideas float over here on ill winds to be introduced in Congress.
Ill wins. I love that. Well, thank you guys again. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Scott, for joining us today for this really important
Thank you,
talk.
guys. Young, thank you. I mean, I was saying we don't have a lobby on every front, but it's great to have your team and your shop making sure these stories get out there and making sure people are aware of the impact, real world impact that it has on us on the small software side.
I appreciate it, Scott. And yes, if you want to learn more about the great work that our membership and our SME community is always doing, please check out actonline.org, or on Twitter as well, ACT Online. Thank you guys again for your wonderful time. And thank you to the audience members for being here today. We'd like to thank you and have a great day.